Breaking news out of England.
An unprecedented crisis has erupted within the British royal family at Balmoral Castle following a shocking incident where Queen Camilla publicly humiliated Prince William in front of gathered royals. But it was the immediate aftermath that truly stunned the room into absolute silence. Prince George William's eldest son reportedly stood up, pointed directly at Camilla, and delivered a remark described as one that sent shock waves through the palace. An outraged Camilla instantly demanded King Charles punish George to defend her authority. However, in a stunning twist, Charles refused to side with his queen. Instead, the monarch quietly ordered the seizure of all security footage, summoned witnesses, and launched an urgent internal investigation, a highly unusual move for an internal royal dispute. What exactly did those tapes reveal to make King Charles completely shift the paradigm? And was George's outburst merely the defense of a 13-year-old boy, or the opening salvo of a much larger confrontation awaiting Camilla? Summer at Balmoral Castle always carried a distinctive stillness native to the Scottish Highlands, where ancient grey stone walls had witnessed decades of the Windsor dynasty's secret tribulations. A private gathering originally intended to foster family bonds suddenly transformed into a suffocating psychological arena where fissures that had simmered for decades threatened to erupt. Seated at the center of a velvet-upholstered sofa, Queen Camilla exuded an aura of authority that was equally detached. Following her historic coronation in May 2023, a milestone that officially and legitimately placed her at the helm of the inner court, after half a lifetime of public controversy, Camilla no longer seemed inclined to conceal her sharpness and influence. Her piercing gaze swept across the faces in the room, ultimately resting on Prince William. The relationship between her and her eldest stepson had never been a smooth river. It was built upon uneasy compromises, painful memories of King Charles's late first wife, Diana, Princess of Wales, and calculations for the future throne. Opposite her, Prince William sat with a straight back, his countenance bearing the characteristic pensive look of a man who had weathered many of life's storms. He was the symbol of stability, the hope of a monarchy requiring a steadfast succession. Ironically, William's very composure had become a thorn in the side of Camilla, who constantly yearned to assert her ultimate dominance within the palace. The tension began to escalate when casual small talk regarding the distribution of royal duties was deliberately redirected. In a calm yet devastatingly sharp tone, Queen Camilla began to speak. She did not hesitate to publicly criticize William's administrative capabilities, disparaging the royal modernization efforts he was pursuing. Her words, like sugar-coated needles, aimed directly at his role as heir to the throne in front of numerous family members and close staff standing in attendance. Camilla asserted that William's caution was merely a sign of weakness, lacking the maturity and fortitude to shoulder the great affairs of state when the time came. This public reprimand was not just a personal insult, but a direct assault on the legitimacy of the future head of the monarchy. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The royal staff present immediately lowered their heads, attempting to diminish their presence so as not to become reluctant witnesses to an internal crisis. Faced with such a direct and ruthless attack, the veins at William's temples throbbed slightly, his hand tightening around the crystal glass he held. It was the natural reflex of a humiliated man, but the discipline of a prince immediately pulled him back. Remembering the bitter lessons from past media crises, William understood that an angry reaction now would only ignite an irreparable battle, turning Balmoral into a battlefield for the tabloids to exploit. He chose silence, a silence filled with pride and endurance. William took a quiet, deep breath, looked directly at his stepmother, and in a low voice requested to discuss the matter privately, later attempting to diffuse and close the debate to restore dignity to the familial atmosphere. Yet William's efforts at reconciliation failed to reach the corner of the room where Prince George sat. At 13, an age where sensitivity and awareness of family honor begin to take sharp focus, George was no longer an oblivious child. The young teenager second in the line of succession to the throne had quietly witnessed from beginning to end every word and every demeaning smirk directed at his father by his step-grandmother. George's young hand clenched into a fist so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His chest heaved with the rapid breaths of indignation. In the mind of the royal child, the reverence for his father was inviolable, and George's gaze at that moment was no longer the submission of a descendant, but the sparked ember of a powerful resistance about to burst forth. Prince William's diplomatic forbearance, far from diffusing the situation, only served to embolden Queen Camilla. Seeing her stepson choose silence to preserve the greater good, she presumed her dominance had achieved its purpose. The voice of the woman at the helm of the inner court continued to ring out, steady yet razor-sharp, drilling into what she deemed the weak points of William's path toward succession. Each word flowed with deep-seated prejudice, moving past a mere disagreement of opinions into a deliberate attempt to dismantle the heir's credibility right in front of their most trusted courtiers. It was precisely at the moment when endurance reached its precipice that an unexpected shift occurred from the corner of the room. Prince George, who from beginning to end had been a silent witness, erupted in an action that left everyone present utterly paralyzed. The 13-year-old teenager abruptly stood up from his armchair. The faint friction of the wool fabric against the cushion sounded starkly clear in the dead silence. The silhouette of a growing boy stretched tall, unyielding, carrying an astonishingly confident demeanor. George did not look toward his father for consensus or protection, nor did he glance at the trembling staff. His eyes locked onto Camilla's face, his gaze direct, cold, and possessing a resolve that far exceeded his years. Without a word of preparation, without the slightest hesitation, the young prince's declaration rang out concise and ruthlessly clear. "You are the enemy." Those 4 short words were uttered at a moderate volume, yet their destructive force was no different from a bolt of lightning striking through the ancient room. Silence immediately enveloped the space, a deadly stunned silence. Everyone present, from the royal family members to the attendants, seemed to stop breathing. A direct assertion of that nature had never surfaced within the complex, guarded etiquette of the palace, especially coming from the mouth of a child, second in the line of succession, aimed squarely at the woman wearing the queen's crown. The triumph on Camilla's face instantly froze, quickly replaced by a wave of absolute fury. Her eyebrows shot up, her facial muscles tightening as her self-esteem took a severe blow in front of her subordinates. Throughout her years governing the inner court, she had never faced such an open and frontal resistance, least of all from a descendant she had always assumed could be easily managed. The dignity of a queen was gravely challenged. Camilla immediately raised her voice, her breath quickening as she invoked her supreme authority to command, demanding that George immediately bow his head and apologize for behavior she condemned as treasonous and an insult to the royal face before their internal public. Yet it was the young prince's next reaction that caused the entire situation to spiral completely out of control. Confronted with the burning wrath of his step-grandmother, George exhibited not a shred of fear or retreat. He did not evade Camilla's piercing gaze. His shoulders remained square, his arms hanging naturally at his sides, though his fingers pressed tightly into his palms to maintain absolute composure. The teenager's face bore a terrifying coldness, a countenance heavily reminiscent of ancient royal portraits of monarchs standing unyielding against adversity. George remained mute, resolutely refusing to take back a single word, showing no sign of remorse or wavering. His unyielding silence acted like a bucket of ice water thrown onto Camilla's anger rendering her demand for an apology a helpless endeavor. The determination of the 13-year-old child pushed the tension to the absolute peak of a crisis. Realizing she could not use her authority to break George's pride and unable to endure the witnessing eyes around them any longer, Camilla whipped around toward King Charles, who had been sitting pensively in the corner of the room until now. Her face was flushed crimson, with a mix of anger and humiliation, her breath coming in short gasps. In a sharp tone that stripped away her usual poise, she demanded that the king immediately hand down the strictest form of discipline upon George. For Camilla, this was no longer an ordinary family quarrel. It had transformed into a power ultimatum. Either her honor would be preserved through the punishment of the child, or her authority within this castle would completely crumble from this day forward. After the emotional storm in the drawing room was temporarily halted by a suffocating dismissal, Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, brought Prince George back to their family's private quarters within the castle. In the quiet space, William looked at his son, his gaze a mixture of astonishment, quiet pride, and the deep anxiety of a royal father. Catherine stepped forward, gently placing a soft hand on George's shoulder, feeling the distinct tension in every muscle of the 13-year-old boy. They began to question him, not with reprimand, but in an effort to understand the reason behind the fierce outburst from a child otherwise renowned for being composed and disciplined. Facing his parents, George showed no signs of panic or remorse. He explained himself deliberately, each word loaded with silent observations gathered over many years. In truth, the suspicion and distance George maintained toward Camilla were not a fleeting emotion, but the result of a highly mature process of observation. Although William and Catherine had always adhered to the principle of protecting their children's minds, and never once speaking ill of or showing hostility toward Camilla in front of them, the innate sensitivity of an heir had allowed George to perceive it all. Through major royal ceremonies and strained family dinners, he had shrewdly captured every sharp look, every patronizing gesture, and the invisible yet cold distance that his step-grandmother always intentionally created with his father. Furthermore, in George's memory, his mother's stories about the love-kindness and noble spiritual legacy of the late Diana, Princess of Wales, had always been a foundational part of his upbringing. Though Catherine only shared them to help her children remember their late grandmother with pride, the profound contrast between the image of an altruistic Diana and the calculating, power-hungry Camilla, whom George witnessed firsthand, naturally formed a clear judgment in his mind. To George, standing up to resist was not an impulsive act, but the eruption of an unshakable belief that his father needed to be protected from forces seeking to diminish his dignity. Recognizing the root of the matter, the inner circle of the Prince of Wales's family immediately formed a fortified wall. William resolutely stood by his son. He understood that George was merely acting on the instinct of a child, witnessing his father being unjustly insulted, and protecting his son's courage at this moment was more important than any diplomatic protocol. Conversely, Catherine was beset by a more pragmatic and sharp anxiety. Seeing through the nature of palace power struggles, the princess feared that Camilla, with her deeply wounded self-esteem, would use all her influence and internal networks to find a way to punish, isolate, or force George into a humiliating silence as a deterrent. While the flames of conflict between the two factions threatened to consume the peace of the dynasty, King Charles's reaction in his private study bore a completely different tone. Confronted with the Queen's ultimatum demanding discipline for his grandson, the monarch showed no haste or favoritism. Having lived through the many ups and downs of life and knowing well the destructive power of baseless rumors, he chose the most rational and impartial solution. Charles refused to draw conclusions based on his wife's emotionally charged accusations. Instead, he officially issued a secret order to Balmoral Castle's security team, demanding the collection and extraction of all surveillance camera data from the drawing room, while simultaneously summoning independent testimony from all royal staff present at the time of the incident. The king's decision acted like a bucket of cold water poured over Camilla's intent to impose her authority, yet it opened a tense new chapter for the entire castle. The official internal investigation began quietly, but under immense pressure. The footsteps of the royal security team moved swiftly through the stone corridors. The recorded tapes were sealed, and testimonies began to be logged under strict supervision. All of Balmoral held its breath and waited, for everyone understood that the outcome of this investigation would not merely dictate right from wrong between a queen and a young prince, but would reshape the power dynamic of the entire royal family in the near future. King Charles's private study at Balmoral Castle was submerged in a solemn and suffocatingly still atmosphere. Upon the large oak desk, files documenting the testimonies of the royal staff were arranged neatly beside a computer monitor displaying camera angles from the internal security system. The truth, which was so often obscured by the fabrications and self-serving distortions of the inner court, now lay bare in its most naked and objective form through silent yet heavily weighted footage. Frame by slow frame, the moving images recreated the entire sequence of events from that afternoon. On the screen, the sharp footage vividly captured the aggressive gestures, the tense facial muscles, and the patronizing pointed finger of Queen Camilla aimed squarely at Prince William. Detailed reports from the independent testimonies of courtiers, royal guards, and serving staff present in the room uniformly pointed to an undeniable fact: Camilla was the instigator. She had actively used her superior position to launch bitter attacks, baselessly disparaging William's capabilities and his role as heir in front of the crowd. The tape showed that it was only when those insults breached the breaking point of a family's endurance that Prince George stood up to resist. The 13-year-old prince's action was entirely a matter of legitimate self-defense, a natural reaction to shield a father being humiliated. Despite the clear evidence exposed before her eyes, Queen Camilla, when summoned for confrontation, maintained a thoroughly unyielding stance and showed not the slightest sign of remorse. Standing before the king's desk, she crossed her arms over her chest, her chin tilted high, her eyes flashing with deep resentment. Camilla resolutely denied that the fault lay with her. To her, the criticisms leveled at William were merely the candid feedback of an elder, whereas George's act of standing up and pointing at the Queen was an intolerable act of insubordination, a direct slap to royal dignity and prestige. She repeatedly wielded her authority as head of the inner court to pressure the king, demanding a severe disciplinary measure directed at her step-grandson to re-establish the order and reverence she believed had been trampled upon. While Camilla continued to speak at length with her imposing arguments, King Charles's gaze remained fixed on a particular detail on the surveillance monitor. It was the moment just before George spoke out. The tape clearly recorded William's actions, despite his face showing obvious hurt and indignation. The Prince of Wales continuously signaled for the staff to withdraw his hand, gesturing softly, his head slightly bowed in an effort to bring the debate to a peaceful end. He had attempted to suppress his personal ego, choosing to endure the humiliation to protect the family atmosphere and prevent a scandal that could destroy the dynasty's credibility. William's endurance and forbearance only served to highlight the outrageous aggressiveness of Camilla in that room. Witnessing the entire event through the most objective lens, a profound disappointment etched itself onto the aged face of King Charles. The truth was entirely clear, and every selfish vindication at this point became meaningless. The king slowly closed the computer monitor and gathered the transcript sheets of the testimonies into a drawer. He raised his head to look directly at his wife standing opposite him. His gaze no longer held its usual hesitation or deference, replaced instead by the cold resolve of a sovereign who had reached a final verdict. The air in the study froze as Charles declared the internal investigation closed, noting that his decision would be officially announced to the entire family tomorrow. The internal royal meeting was convened the very next morning in the main council room of Balmoral Castle. The atmosphere was suffocatingly solemn as the core members of the family took their places. King Charles sat at the head of the table, his countenance bearing the strict gravity of a sovereign preparing to hand down a momentous ruling. His composure at this moment was a stark departure from his hesitation of previous days, a clear sign that the king had stripped away all personal sentiment to act in the name of dynastic justice. Opening the meeting in a low, decisive voice, the king slowly announced his official conclusion, based on the entirety of the evidence gathered from the security cameras and the testimonies of the courtiers. He explicitly pointed out that Queen Camilla was the one who had instigated the conflict, actively choosing to use unprovoked aggressive language to humiliate Prince William in front of subordinates. Charles asserted that Prince George's action did not stem from arrogance or disrespect, but was a direct and legitimate protective response from a son witnessing his father's dignity being unjustly diminished. The king's ironclad declaration completely absolved the 13-year-old child of all accusations of insubordination that Camilla had intentionally tried to impose over the past days. Immediately, a silent wave of reaction surged through the council room. Queen Camilla could not hide her shock and fury at her husband's decision. Her lips pressed into a tight line, her chest heaving with anger, as her supreme self-esteem was ruthlessly dismissed in front of her stepsons. She shifted slightly, her piercing gaze aimed directly at Charles in a silent yet fierce protest. Yet in the face of Camilla's wrath, Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, maintained a thoroughly unyielding demeanor. They sat with straight backs, their eyes meeting their stepmothers directly, without the slightest hint of timidity or retreat. The solidarity and resolute will of the Waleses to protect George formed a fortified wall, crushing any attempt by the Queen to turn the tables. Regardless of the tacit resistance from his wife, King Charles proceeded to the most crucial part of his verdict. He understood that merely dictating right from wrong was insufficient to prevent deep fractures in the dynasty's future. In his capacity as head of the monarchy, Charles slowly drew out a new document, an internal royal regulation he had personally drafted. This document enacted a strict rule, absolutely forbidding any royal family member from utilizing language that was aggressive, humiliating, or derogatory toward one another in all internal activities, as well as in front of palace staff. Any individual who violated this, irrespective of title or role, would face severe disciplinary measures in accordance with royal regulations. This was not just a rule, but a direct deterrent that the king aimed squarely at Camilla's historically patronizing conduct. The room fell into a prolonged silence as the document was formalized. Camilla sat motionless, her hand clenching the silk handkerchief in her lap so tightly it crumpled. Bitterness was etched into every line around her eyes as she realized she had not only failed to punish George, but had also trapped herself in a legal snare established by the king himself. The absolute power she had painstakingly built since the coronation was now shackled by an internal regulation. Before the supreme authority of the sovereign and the united front of William's family, Camilla knew she had no room to retreat. She was forced to bow her head slightly bitterly, accepting the king's verdict in mortifying humiliation, closing a terrifying yet pivotal chapter behind the stone walls of Balmoral. The efforts to keep the crisis hidden behind the gray stone walls of Balmoral Castle ultimately collapsed entirely when an internal source leaked the incident to the media. Within a matter of hours, information regarding the direct confrontation between Prince George and Queen Camilla surfaced on the front pages of major newspapers, creating a media seismic wave of devastating destructive force. From tabloids perpetually hunting for scandal to mainstream news outlets of analytical commentary, all shifted their focus to the drawing room in Scotland. Public opinion both within the United Kingdom and internationally was immediately swept into a fervent wave of discussion, turning the inner court story into a topic of conversation on every street corner and in every office. The leak plunged the royal family into a new media crisis where the public began to split into conflicting currents of opinion. Across newsrooms and on social media platforms, endless debates erupted regarding the boundaries between royal etiquette and family ethics. A small faction of traditional monarchists expressed concern, suggesting that a 13-year-old child's behavior toward the bearer of the Queen's crown was a sign of a fracture in the hierarchy of order. However, that perspective was quickly and entirely overwhelmed by a powerful wave of consensus from the vast majority of the public. People saw through to the core of the matter. George had no intention of rebelling. He was merely acting on pure instinct and the courage of a son to protect his father from a ruthless public humiliation. It was precisely amidst the media chaos that a symbolic comparison emerged and rapidly spread at breakneck speed. Numerous sharp commentators and royal enthusiasts discovered the silhouette of the late Diana, Princess of Wales, within George's resolute, unyielding gaze at Balmoral. The fact that a young prince dared to stand tall looking directly at the most powerful woman in the inner court to speak the truth that no one else in the room dared to utter was praised as the inheritance of his late grandmother's unparalleled spirit of courage. George's image at this moment was no longer that of a child requiring shelter, but had risen to become a symbol of pride and righteousness. A future heir who knew how to stand on his own feet to defend the family honor. In stark contrast to the admiration directed at Queen Camilla faced a wave of fierce backlash unprecedented since her coronation. Unfavorable memories of her past within the public consciousness were suddenly revived relentlessly and ruthlessly. The internal evidence proving she was the instigator, utilizing her status to oppress Prince William, turned her into the focal point of public outrage. The prestige she had painstakingly built through charitable activities and disciplined public appearances vanished into thin air in an instant. Whenever she stepped outside, Camilla now had to confront cold, scrutinizing glares and heavy pressure from public opinion, catastrophic damage to her reputation that she had no way to salvage. The incident at Balmoral finally drew to a close as the news cycles gradually quieted down, but the power dynamic within the palace had completely shifted. Emerging from the crisis, Prince George's image was firmly and deeply solidified within the hearts of the public, defining the status of a future leader of immense fortitude. Standing on the balcony of Buckingham Palace during a subsequent event, George quietly cast his gaze toward the sea of people cheering his name below. He glanced slightly at his father, who was looking at him with eyes full of absolute trust, and then toward Camilla, who now could only stand withdrawn in a corner with visible caution. The inner court battle had ended, and the 13-year-old boy now knew the weight of honor and truth beneath the crown of his future. After reading this story, in your opinion, was Prince George's direct resistance at 13 merely an impulsive outburst from a child or a testament to the fortitude and maturity of a future heir to the throne? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.